very much.
Close the doors and take it.
Thank you. We look like a group of people who have all gone on a holiday in the west of Ireland, and we've ended up in a small little caravan. We're all trapped in that famous episode of Father Ted, you all remember? Who's going to be Graham North?
Did I say the real fact? The real fact of the room is that the table is the other way, that there's lines of chairs going that way. I kind of thought it would be kind of more organized.
7 hours.
Yeah. So we really are in the christening. This is the first outing for this very high-tech, high-spec group. So everybody's very, very welcome indeed. We're delighted to host this special event hosted by the Department of Sociology, Centre for European and Eurasian Studies, and our colleagues in Mussy. Sincere thanks to Anne Hamilton Black, as ever, for her great help in helping us to stream the event and to record it. Now, the title of today's event is the European Parliament, European Elections, and the Future of the European Union's Socio-economic Governance. We're delighted to welcome our colleague, Dr. Anna Elomäki from the University of Tampere in Finland. I'll say a little bit more about Anna in just a moment, but just by way of introduction, you're all aware that this is a year of mammoth elections. Virtually half of the people on the planet are eligible to vote in elections of different kind. I would suggest in our parochial sense, the European Parliament elections are absolutely crucial for a whole variety of reasons. One of them is that the European Parliament has increased its authority with every single constitution revision the European Union has made. And yet, for many reasons, it remains kind of unknown and unloved. Lots of people still think about the European Parliament as a second-order election. It certainly isn't. I'm delighted to welcome our colleague who has had the courage to actually stand for election in the upcoming contest in this constituency. I don't know about you, I am terrified about what these elections portend. We have a situation where in 16 out of 27 member states, the radical right or far right parties are polling at above 20%. In many of those states, they are at 30% or above and are the leading force in politics. The radical right will most likely come back with a very significantly enhanced presence in the parliament, and that is going to have knock-on effects, not just on how the institution is run, but on the policy output from the EU. That in combination with national elections, where similarly radical right parties are, in my view, almost bound to increase their representation in parliament. So this is a very timely event, sort of 2 months out, just over 2 months out from those elections. And we are delighted to welcome Anna, our colleague from Tampere. She is an academic research fellow and senior researcher. She has vast experience in researching themes around gender, gender equality, the intersection between gender and politics, gender and broadly the socio-economic sphere. She's worked at a very senior level on European Research Council projects. She's written important work for all of the outstanding journals in political science and sociology, including Comparative European Politics, the Journal of Common Market Studies, the American Political Science Review, and many more. She has also co-authored a number of very important volumes on the themes that we're engaged in today. And we are really delighted that she's with us. She's here in Ireland for a number of weeks, partly doing research on some of her current projects, but we're thrilled that she's here with us to talk to us and to lead us in this discussion about the Parliament and socioeconomic affairs. So Anna, I'll hand over to you, and it's a great pleasure to do so.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for such a nice introduction. I'm gonna time myself that I could talk about these issues for ages. So better to put timer on. So I thought what I could talk about to start this event. And I decided that I'm going to really be drawing on the research that I did together with 5 colleagues in this mentioned ERC project that focused on the European Parliament's political groups. So we studied for 5 years the Parliament's political groups from the perspective of democracy and equality, looking at the policies and the practices under the leadership of Johanna Kantola. And exactly because that's kind of topical today, I draw some themes from that research that we did together. The reason why I'm in Ireland now, as John already said, is a bit different. So now I'm working on a project of my own that focuses on the implementation of EU's economic governance in member states, with a focus on the European semester process. And Ireland is one of my country cases. So I'm here to do interviews and learn about Ireland. But maybe we talk about that on another event in a couple of years when the results are in. So now it's nice to start talking about the research that we already did in the EUGenDem project. And maybe just to give a bit of background about the project before I go more towards the results. Of course, there is already a lot of research about the European Parliament's political groups and democracy. And one of the dominant ways to talk about the European Parliament's political groups from democracy perspective has been to focus on the party political competition between them, to kind of look what are the ideological options that are there available in the European Parliament. And another strand of research has been thinking about how the European Parliament's political groups are related to the electorate, then kind of more these representation, election type of issues. And some of the themes that this previous research looked at was how cohesive the political groups are. Do the MEPs vote between the group, for the group? Do they vote along the national lines? What kind of alliances are possible between the political groups? And a lot of this research was relying on mainly quantitative data, not only, but there was a lot of research based on the voting in the parliament, the voting patterns. So our approach was a bit different. So we also had this focus on democracy, but we thought about it a bit differently. So first of all, we thought that also what happens within the political groups matters for democratic legitimacy of the European Parliament. And we really focused on democratic practices. So we really looked at issues like transparency, openness, inclusion. And one of the aspects of our research was also to think that gender and gender equality, they are democratic or democracy-related issues. So we studied the gendered practices, discrimination within the groups, and conceptualized this in terms of democracy as well. We did a lot of work on formal and informal institutions, relying on the new institutionalist scholarship. So we looked at leadership, decision-making between the political groups, decision-making within the political groups, how the political groups are formed. We looked at the impact of populism. We looked at what happened with Brexit. So a lot of themes. And we also looked at 3 specific policy areas that were economic policy, social policy, that I will be talking today a bit, and gendered violence. And our focus was qualitative. So we did altogether 140 interviews with MEPs from different political groups, with political group staff and EP administrative staff. And in addition, one of us, Jerry Miller, did an amazing parliamentary ethnography on the European Parliament, the first of its kind, probably. So today I wanted to kind of talk about 3 different things that build on our findings. So first, I just wanted to take you inside the European Parliament's political groups. They are not that well known. So just to kind of give you some idea how they work and what the issues there might be. And then just to come a bit more to the between the political groups level to talk a bit about how the parliamentary politics works in the field of social policy. And then just to conclude, say something about how the elections might affect policy making in this policy field in the parliament. So starting with the political groups, I don't know how familiar you are with them, but in the current parliamentary term, there were basically 7 groups plus the non-attached MEPs. So the biggest group, the European People's Party, centre-right, the second biggest, Socialist and Democrats, centre-left, then Renew Europe, liberal centre-right as well, going then to the Greens, and then the radical right groups, Identity and Democracy, and the ECR group. So I don't know how it's here in Ireland, but at least in Finland, when we talk about the European elections, it's a very national level debate. We talk about what the Finnish political parties want from the EU, but we don't really talk about what the EP's political groups want. And after all, the MEPs we elect in the European Parliament, they do function within the political groups. And it's therefore really important to know a bit more about the groups also in terms of the national policy debates. I bet that in Finland we have candidates for the EU elections who don't even know in which political group they would sit in the parliament. And the general public, of course, knows even less about them. So the political groups matter more and more for the parliamentary work. The parliament has changed its rules in ways that give the political groups even more power over non-attached MEPs. And the political groups, they really work, or they really shape the way individual MEPs or national political parties can work within the European Parliament. So first of all, the group size is really important when it comes to the distribution of European Parliament's leadership positions. Who gets, which group gets how many reports, how important reports, but also funding. And then the political groups decide further which national delegations get these leadership positions, which national delegations get which reports, how much speaking time they get, but also how much funding they get. And again, size matters. So the size of national delegation is a key power aspect in the intra-group dynamics. But nevertheless, all the research says that the MEPs are still more likely to vote within their national delegations, so in the same way than the other people from the same national political party come, than along the political group line. And the reason for this is that in some ways the sticks and carrots are still in the hands of the national parties and delegations. So basically the political groups decide which delegations get the important parliamentary reports, but it's the head of the national delegation in the parliament who says that, well, you know, you can have this. So the group and the national delegations, there is this kind of power struggle between them. And one of the articles that we wrote was really about this topic of national delegations and their role within the political groups. And I already told the story earlier today, but we didn't even plan to study this. We had these 140 interviews, but then when we started to read them through, we realized that the MEPs are actually sometimes talking more about their national delegations than they are talking about their political groups. And the nationality, the different delegations was a topic that came up all the time. So we wanted to look a bit closer into that and to really try to understand what the role of the national delegations within the political groups is. So something we found out in this regard was that there is very little formal rules at the parliament level or at the political group level that would somehow determine what the roles and powers of the delegations are. And whatever formal rules we could find, like in the group statutes, in the European Parliament rules of procedure, it was mainly about decision-making bodies. And some of the political groups had rules that said that all the national delegations would be represented in the main decision-making bodies. But then others might have taken a different approach and say that our key decision-making bodies are elected. They are not based on nationality, they are based on merit. So there were different approaches there. But eventually, everything apart from that, that was related to the role of national delegations was based on informal practices. rules, practices that are not written anywhere, things that just kind of happen. So for instance, we found that although there are formal rules about voting within the groups that in some ways determine how decisions are made within the political groups, in practice, it is informal backroom deals. And in these informal backroom deals, the power of the national delegations, the big national delegation, is often then emphasized. You might have the Germans and the French coming together in a room and saying, like, you know, our political group should now say this. And then that is what's often happening. But then Finland, where I come from, and Ireland, they are small delegations. And this level of informality, its role, it's in some ways also good news for the small delegations, because you can achieve so much with networking and building trust and cooperating. And the small delegations that don't have the numbers for the backroom deals, they can then use these other methods to get their voices heard. And there's a bit of difference also between the groups in terms of like what this informality did. So in some groups, these informal rules might have actually balanced the power of big and small delegations. Greens, for instance, was one example of that. But in other groups, these informal practices basically just solidified the power of the big national delegations. But overall, yes, the national delegations, they are still really important power players, but there's a lot of variation between the political groups, how their role looks in practice. Another theme regarding how the political groups really work and how decisions are made that we looked at was the policy making within the political groups. There's a lot of research on the European Parliament that focuses on the coalitions between the groups, trying to kind of understand how the political groups create alliances with other political groups on specific topics and how the MEPs negotiate across the political groups. But very little was actually said about how decisions are made within the political groups. But that's of course important as well. And one of the things that we found out was that the groups are quite different in terms of how important having a unified group line is for them in the first place. So you would have the Eurosceptic and the radical right groups who wouldn't think it's so important. So let's all the MEPs disagree, we don't mind. That's not our thing. But then you would have the big groups, the EPP group and the S&D, for whom looking unified is very important politically, because like that they can get power within the parliament and advance their views towards the EP's position. In the European Parliament, there is no formal group discipline. So basically, even in these groups that think that unified group line is important, the MEPs can basically vote freely. So that's the formal part. But the informal story that we found from the interviews was again something a bit different. So in particular, the EPP, S&D, they had all these informal practices in the daily working of the political group that really aimed at sidelining disagreement and dissent within the groups. So for instance, here you have two quotes. First, there's an EPP MEP who's explaining how if you raise radical issues within the group, you just don't get supported. But then if you discuss with people one-to-one, they are like, yes, yes, yes. But when it comes to these official decision-making bodies within the group, no chance. And then here it's a quote from S&D MEP, quite high-level MEP, who was the coordinator of one committee, and who was explaining that when there's a vote in the committee or even at the plenary level, they want to send the dissenting national delegations to have a coffee so that the voting results. So in principle, free votes, but in practice, the political groups do have mechanisms to kind of make the group appear more unified, and the dissent is not always eagerly heard. Another thing about the policy making within the political groups that we found out, other people have written about this as well, is that there has been this move that has moved power from the national delegations and individual MEPs to the group level, the group bodies. So you could say that the decision making within the political groups has become more centralized or rationalized, in the sense that they try to make the decision making more effective. If you have, I don't know, 40 member parties from 28 different countries, the decision making can get a bit messy. So you need to have procedures that somehow allow you to solve conflicts early, ensure that there is consistency between the policy areas, and also to make the decision making efficient. But at the same time, these centralization tendencies, they have decreased transparency. The MEPs within the groups might often not know where the decisions are made and by whom. Sometimes it's a bit of a mystery for them. Decisions just appear, or they might not be in the right time, in the right place to influence them. And yet another thing that we thought was interesting is that there is this discourse when you talk with the group leadership. They say that, yes, in our group, everybody can contribute. We have this culture, this open culture, but then eventually in practice, it is often a few inner circle MEPs within the political groups who are at the forefront. So this might be the group leadership, it might be the heads of big national delegations, and it might be the coordinators. So that are the people that the political group votes to be in charge of policymaking within a specific committee. And the leadership takes a bit different roles in different political groups. You have ones that are more hierarchic, but the leadership is really trying to, like, in a way, consolidate a unified position. Then you have another groups like the Greens, where it's more about moderation. And then you have others like the radical right, but the leadership doesn't interfere that much in the internal policy making. Expertise is, of course, an interesting issue, because the European Parliament is always thought to be this very expertise-oriented parliament. And we did write an article about that as well. And we found that, yes, MEPs who have topical expertise on a specific matter can become influential within their political groups, but the expertise alone, it doesn't really get you there, because this issue is related to nationality, how long you have been in the parliament, and so forth. They kind of matter as well. So expertise brings you influence mainly in the less hierarchical groups like the Greens, less so within the EPP, for instance. So if we kind of sum up a bit our findings of the internal life of the political groups, first of all, we were surprised about the high levels of informality. We would have expected to see formal procedures and written rules much more, but then many things, how the political groups are formed, how the decision-making goes, how the leaders are elected, there was informality everywhere here. And these opaque and non-transparent practices, they're not a problem for the far right only, for instance. This is something that basically belongs to the everyday lives of all the political groups in the parliament. And this, we think, is a challenge to transparency, openness, and inclusion, and from this perspective to democracy within the European Parliament more broadly. And the other conclusion maybe is just to say that the political groups are not the same. They are very different, actually, in terms of how they work internally, what role they give to national delegations. There are some are more and some are less focused on national interests and delegations. Some are more transparent and meritocratic. Some are less so, more based on backroom deals. And some of them are more gendered in their practices, meaning that there is a lot of discrimination, sexism and so forth, and some are actually really trying to advance equality with internal practices. But to make this a bit more concrete, and also to move a bit to talk about how the relationships between the political groups are, let's then move and talk a bit about social Europe and social policy. We looked at different policy fields in the approach, and social policy was one of them. And what I will now say about this mainly draws on a work that I wrote with Paul Copeland that's still under review. So if we think about the European Parliament and social Europe, I guess the first thing that we can safely say is that the European Parliament has historically been a defender of social Europe. It has really tried to say that the EU should do more on social issues. And the EP's increased powers after the Lisbon Treaty that John already referred to basically made the European Parliament, or moved the European Parliament from an agenda setter on the social matters to co-legislator on social policy. But then at the same time, there has also been increased politicization and polarization in the European Parliament regarding social Europe. Like, it's a polarizing issue also between the member states. So you do have the division lines between the political groups. There's the left groups and the right groups. There's the pro-EU, there's the anti-EU, but also this GAL-TAN axis. So more these new cultural divisions has a role to play. But social Europe is also extremely divisive issue within the political groups. And here in particular, the center right, so the EPP group and the Liberal Renew group are the most divided. And something also I'd like to still emphasize that within this broader division about social issues, gender and gender equality have also become increasingly polarizing issue in the European Parliament, and that reflects on the conflicts on broader social Europe themes. So with Paul, we looked at 3 recent social directives. So the Work-Life Balance Directive, the Minimum Wage Directive, and the Pay Transparency Directive. And we wanted to understand what happens there in the European Parliament at the committee stage when the Parliament takes a position on the Commission's proposal. So we looked at the amendments that the different political groups and MEPs made to the Commission's proposals to understand how much and what kind of politicization there is at the committee level, but also how this politicization is managed. So what we saw, it's maybe not surprising, is that there was really strong politicization both for and against stronger social Europe in the Parliament. And this showed in the strengthening and weakening amendments to the Commission's proposal. But when we looked at the strengthening amendments, the main political groups were actually quite careful. So they might change some numbers in the Commission's proposal, but they would by and large accept what the Commission was saying and not trying to expand it that much. The radical new ideas came from these liberal challenger groups, so the leftist group and the Greens. When it comes to opposition, it's maybe not surprised that the radical right groups were really, really strongly opposed to what the Commission was proposing on social Europe. But also significant part of the liberal MEPs and the EPP MEPs were trying to weaken the directives. And here the big themes that caused trouble were the scope of EU action. This might have been about national collective bargaining, for instance. Impact on companies, administrative burdens, costs was another theme, and gender and gender equality was a third theme that really caused opposition. And one could see that the ECR group, for instance, was really often focused only on the gender theme. basically trying to remove any reference to gender from any of these directives. And perhaps what also surprised us was that the strongest opposition often came from within the EPP group. So it wasn't the radical right, it was actually the center right or some national delegations there that had most beef with what the Commission was proposing. And what we also saw, the level of polarization and politicization varied by the directive. So the work-life balance was quite well received, quite consensual, but then the minimum wage directive, on the other hand, was extremely polarizing and also within the political groups, because here really even the leftist groups were divided. Many just didn't want to have this directive. But despite all this opposition, all these weakening efforts, what actually happened was that the European Parliament and at the committee level was able to take a quite strong position on social Europe. So in all these three cases, the Parliament's position was a lot stronger than what the Commission had proposed. And we thought with Paul that this is thanks to specific institutional politicization management mechanisms that you can find at place when the group starts to negotiate. So we called the first one of these normative filtering, and by this we mean that because European Parliament has this identity and self-image as a strong social actor, this then also has an impact on how the negotiations go. So basically all the weakening input, all the weakening amendments was mainly disregarded. It just didn't make it to the Parliament's position. But then there was this other filtering mechanism that we called technocratic filtering, that basically filtered out any too radical proposals to improve the directive. So basically what was left was this type of technical numbers game where the European Parliament would ask to change a number in the Commission's proposal to make it a bit better. But there were very few new ideas, new radical ideas, efforts to really broaden the boundaries of social Europe. So just for the last 3-5 minutes, I wanted to say something about the futures of social Europe after the elections. And I think social Europe is not often election theme in the European Parliament elections, but at the same time, if you look at the Eurobarometer studies, the citizens in Europe, they want more social Europe, and they also want the EU to do more there. So maybe it should actually be a theme. And if we just recap what happened with social Europe now in the current 5-year term, quite a lot actually. So under von der Leyen's Commission, the Commission continued to put out a lot of new social legislation. And this was something Juncker Commission already started up with. So there's the minimum wage, pay transparency, violence against women, platform work, and many others. But there was even more soft initiatives, care strategy, child guarantee, platform against homelessness. Like so many initiatives that it kind of like, it's even difficult to remember all of them at once, like a jungle of non-binding initiatives. And there was also some efforts under von der Leyen Commission to shift this historic subordination of social policies to economic policies at EU level. So even in her political guidelines, von der Leyen promised that social welfare and well-being will come before the economic goals. One can, of course, then think if anything actually shifted here, apart from the rhetoric. I guess the jury is still out there, but I assume at least like in the mechanisms of EU's economic governance, there wasn't probably that much shift there. But what's after the elections then? So like John already said, there is the predicted increase in the number of radical right MEPs. So the ID group and the ECR group would become a lot stronger. And this might make achieving coalitions for stronger social Europe more difficult. The pro-EU political groups that kind of were passing legislation together this term, so the EPP, the S&D, the Greens, and the Liberal Renew group, they might still have a majority in the next parliament as well. But at the same time, there's also the possibility of like issue-based right-wing coalitions. The political right groups, they haven't until now really participated in the decision-making in the parliament. They speak anti-gender, anti-EU things in the plenary, but when it comes to negotiations, they are not really there. But that might change. They have already indicated that this time they actually want to have an impact. And social policy is one field where these shifts might certainly show somehow. So first of all, the European Parliament needs to support the new European Commission president and their program. So in von der Leyen's program, there was a lot on social Europe, probably also because she needed to get support from the liberal and left-wing groups. But what will happen now? Because such a big part of the EPP and the liberals don't actually support more social Europe. And the von der Leyen might have to make some concessions towards the ECR group as well. So are we going to get a commission program for next term that's as strong on social Europe? We might not. The other question is then what's going to happen in the negotiations within the European Parliament. So will the European Parliament be able to filter the opposing attitudes and amendments anymore in the next term? Will it be able to find agreement on these quite strong progressive positions on Commission's directive? They might not be as progressive anymore. And the last point I put here is that, of course, the European Parliament makes laws together with the Council. And what has helped the European Parliament to have a strong negotiation position in these interinstitutional negotiations is when it has a large, relatively unified coalition behind its positions. But the majorities might be wearing thinner on social Europe. That might also mean that the European Parliament can ask even less. So I think these were the themes that I wanted to now start this discussion with. And here are some of our publications. So we do have a book on European Parliament's political groups, an edited volume. And we also did a Belgrade Pivot book on the methodological aspects of our project. Mainly, the work was led by Valentin Berthet, who did a PhD in the project. It's a really nice guide to how to do qualitative research in the parliaments. And then there is over 70 research articles, or all are open access.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was truly fascinating. It was like looking under the bonnet of the car, you know, to see how the Parliament actually functions and the informality. I think that may be news to a lot of people, that it's just as important as the formal rules that structure the place. We're going to have lots of time for questions and answers. So if you have a question germinating, you might just hold on to it for a few minutes, but I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Pauline Cullen, who has huge expertise in this area as well, to respond briefly to what Anna has related to us. So over to you, Pauline.
Thank you. So thanks to Anna, because it's a very long project with over 140 interviews, big team of researchers over a 4-year period, really, for data collection, almost 5 for
5 for the whole project.
The whole project, exactly, with lots of moving parts in it. And I think one of the biggest contributions of the project is, as John said, to offer this kind of fine-grained analysis of not just perhaps the fabric of how agreements are made, but also the ways in which informal practices shape whose voice is heard, where influence settles. And also, of course, kind of, I suppose, picking apart some of the assumptions perhaps we have held for a long time about how the party groups negotiate internally, but also externally. I mean, I think the project has also been of particular merit because it has raised the issue of gendering the study of European governance. And that's something that has been themed certainly in European integration studies for a while. But this was the first very big empirical effort to map in a systematic way how the Parliament was gendering and gendered. And towards the end of the project, also the issue of race, particularly in Parliament, was also revealed.
Yeah, it's overwhelmingly quite.
Yes, impressive, absolutely. It has become even less diverse since the British MEPs have left. So certainly all of these things matter, and there were things that the research team were certainly concerned about, because in asking those kinds of deeply social scientific questions around how the fabric of an institution is laden with power, then I know there was a regret of not being able to talk to other staff, particularly at the lower levels of the Parliament, from those who clean the institution to those who provide catering, all the different constituent groups and how they work to create this facade, the spectacle, if you like, of a particular claim of European democracy in that particular way. But even so, I would suggest, if people have interest in this at all, to have a look at the vast number of research outputs, because they're really quite diverse and very interesting. I just have a couple of things that have come up for me. I mean, I started working on European integration a long time ago in the context of doctoral work and looking at civil society as a particular actor in the late 90s that was trying to shape social Europe at that period of time. And part of this project is particularly interested, I suppose, in the national delegations, but also there has been an effort to think maybe about the larger infrastructure of interests that try to influence or create soft power maybe around the political groups. And I think also, you know, we've been beating the drum and thinking about the democratic deficit at European level for a long time. There's a lot of conversation around citizen involvement. But as we shift towards the elections now, we also have return to the citizen. Actually, if you look at the Commission's formal position on particularly its plans around its European democracy action plan, some of the criticism of that is that it seems to bypass political parties in the Parliament. Certainly the citizen panels, the Conference for the Future of Europe is about placing the citizen as the direct object, if you like, or, you know, of relation to the European Union, trying to sell it directly to the citizen. And political parties were almost bypassed in the Parliament, particularly in that particular conversation. And in some sense, one of those criticisms is the notion of having an overly technocratic and legalistic approach to things like media disinformation. So facing into a period of kind of electoral change, the fear of, you know, what is considered to be the rise of anti-democratic forces, but the Commission's posture has been so, and I know John feels this way quite strongly, it's been very technocratic or legalistic. Like, it's not a political actor in itself. It's almost a passive observer. And then it has created certain remedies. And I think this is quite clear if we look at efforts to reform the Parliament itself as an actor. So we have the 1976 Electoral Act, and then we had a resolution in 2022 from the Parliament that asked to go back and look at rules on political advertising, particularly media disinformation, to introduce a gender quota, to suggest strongly to member states when they were fielding candidates to use a quota where they could. And the opposition to that resolution has been significant. It has never passed through the council. It certainly won't apply for the elections coming up. And for me, the interesting thing, and I think you've alluded to it in the way you try to disaggregate and talk about the fact that we can't expect always to understand everything on the left and the right. You know, there will be these clear divides. Sometimes it's clearer in some of the social policy legislation. No big surprise that hard right isn't in favour of some of it. But rather progressive civil society groups across Europe have opposed some of these proposed reforms that would have implications for the Parliament, because they know that that kind of legislation has been used in the US, to an extent in the UK, but particularly, we'll say, in Hungary and other countries, to close down civil society. So they're very nervous about the notion of these kinds of reforms. And you have this strange kind of alignment between the left and the hard right about trying to block changing how the Parliament works and reforming it, or this very technocratic or legalistic. So in the context of that, I'm not sure there's a question, really, I suppose, from your perspective, Anna, thinking about the Parliament as an actor going forward, you know, it doesn't change easily.
Mm.
You've talked about some changes there. It's very contingent on what happens outside of it. What do you think in terms of if what could we expect in terms of even the practices and processes of Parliament themselves being put under the microscope again? We've had the scandals, which were capitalized by the far right, but actually the donkey work of reforming the institution to make it more fit for purpose, to make it more robust and resilient, doesn't seem to have much political support. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to respond to that. There's a question in there about what you think, you know, would it become a political issue in the next election? Do you think could it be linked to social policy issues that we need, not just as empty talk about a stronger Parliament, but could there actually be other reforms you think that could happen alongside it?
Yeah, I guess that reforms in the Parliament, they take time, but they have been made, and one type of reform that has been relatively easy to pass there are these types of reforms that have increased the power of the political groups.
Yes.
And a lot of the reforms that have been made, they actually, because we were talking about technocracy earlier as well. So the reforms that have been made have basically also made the Parliament more technocratic, so to say. So limit still the plenary discussions, make it somehow more difficult for the independent MEPs to function in the Parliament. And this has, of course, been something that the main political groups have been happy to do. They have also been seen as measures that would help to some ways block the influence of the radical right within the Parliament. But then at the same time, we see the radical right organizing in political groups and being able to then access all the benefits that come with it.
Yeah.
And then here you do have these informal practices again. So the cordon sanitaire process that basically means that the big main pro-EU political groups would not give the committee leadership positions or any of the important reports for the radical right groups. This mainly has now influenced the ID group. So you can also do things informally, basically. And if you get enough of the political groups on board, also the informal ways of changing the work might be effective. One of the things that we were looking at in terms of reforming the internal rules and functioning related to the Me Too campaign. Yes. Because there was a lot of allegations within the European Parliament of sexual harassment. And it's a very hierarchical place in the sense that the MEPs have their assistants who basically are directly under the MEPs. They don't have maybe any other boss than the MEPs. So it's a very hierarchical relationship. It's very much a setting that's quite prone for sexual harassment. And to counter this, there was then this Me Too EP campaign that gathered stories about sexual harassment in the Parliament. They had a blog where they posted it. And one of their main goals was to change the rules of the Parliament. So obligatory training on sexual harassment for all the MEPs, but also other types of shifts in rules that would have improved the position of the staff. But no. So even the progressive political groups might not necessarily support progressive changes when at some level they think it is conflicting with their own existing power interests.
Yeah. And actually a year ago when the Qatargate scandal broke, you may remember all the allegations about basically bribery and corruption.
Yeah.
The Parliament just buried it. They promised that they would review their rules of procedure, and it's been completely buried and virtually nothing has happened since. There are fascinating issues there. I'm going to throw this out to everybody. So if anybody has a question for Anna, we might take them maybe two together, if that's okay. Yes, Tobias and then Mary.
Right, thanks. When it comes to discipline within the political groups, how is that enforced? Because at the national level, of course, we have like, removing whip from some committees, And that then has consequences, removing the whip from somebody that then has consequences for their electoral prospects later on. But the EP would seem to me to be one step further removed, because not the political group's decision who stands for MEP for the Social Democratic Party in Germany. It's their decision. So it's different loyalties that are at play here. I don't know if you have any insights into that.
Yeah, that was a good question. And that's also one of the big differences between most national parliaments and the European Parliament, because there is no formal group discipline for there's no whips. Some of the more UK oriented groups have a position of the whip, but not everybody even has that. So, but then given this, actually, when it comes to voting, the European Parliament's political groups are almost surprisingly cohesive. So actually, maybe the puzzle is, why are the groups so cohesive when they vote, given that there is no discipline? And scholars have looked for the answers from different sides. And one of the explanations has been that the decision-making is quite bottom-up, or it was before these centralization procedures started to kick in. So basically, MEPs in committees were quite free to think themselves what the group line on certain issue would be. They would talk with their colleagues from the other committees and other countries, and it'd be this type of bottom-up approach that would then create the sense that this is our common decision, and then the different national interests would get heard quite early on along the way. But then it's true that there is not much rewards that the political groups could hand to MEPs who are the loyal soldiers, and there is also not that many sanctions that they could impose against the ones who consistently vote against, because eventually it's the national delegations who are going to decide which of their MEPs gets a report, gets a position. And because of this, we also do see in the EPP group, for instance, there is this female MEP from Finland, who, when you look at the voting charts, is more S&D than EPP, for instance, is often causing trouble within the group, contesting the decisions, voting differently. But she nevertheless gets positions because her national party believes in her.
Well, it was fascinating. A couple of weeks ago, you may remember that the Irish delegation in the EPP voted against the instruction of Manfred Vader and the EPP leadership on the nature restoration.
Yeah.
It was astonishing. That would never happen in a national parliament. Go back to Tobias' question.
The Finns, they voted against the forest legislation.
John, yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's very instructive for those of us who aren't experts in the area. I suppose I was thinking, you know, as a lay person thinking about the EU, I sort of buy the whole line, Weberian bureaucracy, you know, that it's like so rule bound, and you mentioned the word hierarchical a few times. But at the same time, what you reveal is the informality of the practices and the filtering processes and the management of dissent, which is all down to kind of people who have, well, a little bit of numbers, but also maybe strong characters that can express themselves. So it's actually the opposite of bureaucracy in a way. And that tension just came across to me very much. But also the other aspect of that, I suppose, is that, and you didn't use the word, but I just felt like there's a lot of performativity, that a lot of it is about sort of the optics. And then there's all this kind of skullduggery and dealing going on in the background, but that for the watching public or listening public, it's a performance, really. So I just wondered how you'd respond to that sort of question.
Yeah, I think it was really nice idea to bring the concept of performativity here, because you see it at different levels. If one watches the plenary debates, one can see all of them online. It's a performance. It's not a real debate. The political groups have received the speaking slots, they have distributed them, the MEPs have practiced their speeches. So it's kind of theater. It's theater. Then you do have the blue cards. It was like one of these inventions to make the debates more lively. So you can basically raise a blue card and then you get to comment on somebody, and then so that's the only lively element there. But even that's a performance, because people do those things to have nice material for their TikTok and YouTube channels.
I mean, Nigel Farage was just
Yeah. But then it's also like at the political group level. So what you said made me think about the group plenary. So basically, the highest decision-making body in all the political groups is called group plenary. So it's basically this meeting where every single MEP from the group comes together to make decisions, or supposedly make decisions. But of course, the decisions have been made. So somewhere before. So basically, this group plenary that formally is the decision-making body, it's a performance where you basically come, you vote, you discuss, but you maybe like give the aura as if this would be it. You perform democracy in a way.
I just want to ask Rory, you go first.
Yes, thank you. Really, really interesting. A question. Sorry. I think in terms of, and thank you for your kind words on courage. I don't know if it's courage or madness, but probably maybe a little bit of both. But in terms of the disconnect between the citizens and the EU project, I think for me anyway, one of the key issues is the question of social rights, and that Europe hasn't progressed enough, and neither have individual countries progressed social rights sufficiently, particularly around the basic things like housing, like homelessness, you know, as you've talked about, workers' rights, more recently, cost of living. So I think that Europe has to put those central, but then the question becomes, well, how? And is that question, maybe in terms of what Mary is talking about, you know, she doesn't see the bureaucracy, but is the Commission the bureaucracy that, you know, and what it progresses and what it puts forward is limited in terms of social rights, is what you talked about there. And so that no matter what the Parliament does, if you don't have a European Commission pushing really strong progressive social rights, there's a problem. And how do we overcome that? And how can we progress social rights more? Have you any ideas around that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, something that the European Parliament would definitely want to reform, not about maybe its own internal practices, but about the broader decision-making setting, is its power. It would want to be able to make political initiatives for all, because now it's only the European Commission that can do that. So therefore, of course, the Commission is in full control, basically, of what is going to come out of the legislative machine. Maybe not the output as such, not fully, because the Parliament and the Council, they can amend it. But nevertheless, what is proposed is in the hands of the Commission. Of course, one could say that some of these directives that were now in the current term passed, like minimum wage, for instance, that has been something that the European Parliament has been calling for a long time. So you could, of course, say that maybe the European Parliament had some agenda-setting power of bringing the issue kind of on the agenda. And I would say that it's the same with the directive on violence against women. What's the real proper name now? Combating violence against women. Yeah. So here too, it's something that the Parliament has specifically asked. But then
the Commission will not table proposals if it thinks that they are going to be rejected by either the Council or Parliament. So it has to regulate Parliament as a body. Which didn't have to previously, because it's co-legislator.
Exactly. And that's why I think, well, there is the Parliament has, like I said, it has the power to basically nominate the Commission President. And it's not only a vote on the person, it's also a vote on the program. And we saw that also last term, von der Leyen got majority of 8 votes. It was really, really tight. And even to get that, there was a lot of things in her program, also on Social Europe, that her own party, the EPP, was not that happy with, but they had to do it. So this is also one way for the Parliament to get things on the agenda. But it's hard to change the big setting.
Can I ask you about this? Because if we had been meeting a year ago, I would have said, I thought Ursula von der Leyen genuinely had been a good president of the Commission. I've been astonished at what has happened since last September. Her unequivocal support for Israel, I think, has been just execrable. I just can't understand it. Secondly, the European Green Deal was absolutely at the heart of her program. She recently just gutted it and disowned it with the pesticides measure. And then you saw what the EPP tried to do on the Nature Restoration Act. Absolutely central programs of her Green Deal. Thirdly, on migration, it's been astonishing. Last week, she goes to Egypt with Giorgia Meloni, and they do this incredibly squalid deal with the Egyptian dictatorship, which is only the latest one they have done, Tunisia and Libya earlier. But my question is the reason for this that she's obviously going for re-election? She got through last time by a very small margin with the votes of people on the centre left and Renew Europe. This time around, we were in Brussels a couple of weeks ago. Everywhere I went, people said to me, she doesn't know me. We did coincide, sort of.
Yeah.
But everywhere I went, everybody said to me, it's a done deal. Ursula von der Leyen is coming back as Commission President. And I can't believe that this is true, because I can't see people on the centre left and even in Renew Europe on the basis of Gaza alone voting for her in the way that they did last time. But I really want to ask you about the potential realignment and the new relationship between the EPP and the ECR, because as you said, the numbers for the radical right aren't enough. They may come back with 170, but the two groups have always fought with each other. There are really substantial differences. But what is happening, I think, is this increasing closeness between the EPP and the ECR. And to me, that's just as dangerous if you're a progressive. Meloni has become the kingmaker of European politics. And this is what I fear, that when we get to July, von der Leyen's re-election will be really sponsored by the ECR, and even a lot of the ID people may vote for her as well. So does that mean inevitably that the next Commission programme is going to be substantially more to the right than in 2019?
Well, I think here I don't have much to add to your analysis. Basically, everything that you said, it's true, and that's where it very likely points out. I mean, I don't have any research analytical perspective, kind of just speculating what might happen, but it's obvious that the EPP and the ECR are getting closer together. And there has also been research already on the current term to look at their voting patterns on specific issues like migration, for instance.
I'm not an expert on this.
Exactly. So what you do see there is alignment on the policy issues between the EPP and the ECR. So it could be motivated simply by political power, seeing that there's more and more radical right MEPs secure your seat, secure the position of your national party. So kind of just adjust your position a bit to keep the votes. But there has been also in the parliament this realignment that you can see. And I just read a story from EU Observer, one of the European media, where they interviewed key MEPs from the ECR and ID group, and they are openly talking about how they want to lure on the next term the EPP away from the S&D on some key questions, which are climate and migration.
And if we could add to that, that the makeup of the commission, it really depends on the outcome of the elections. So the treaty says it is taking account of the European Parliament elections. So that means the radical right will have the right to nominate European commissioners for the first time. And the portfolios they get will be very interesting. Partly this depends on the council as well, but even there, you know, we're seeing a strengthening of radical right representation in governments in Finland and Italy, potentially in Austria, the Netherlands and elsewhere. So the whole constellation of power just might look radically different come the summertime than what we've been used to.
Is there another contender if von der Leyen isn't given the job? Is there someone that could counterbalance?
Well, there's a very famous Irish left-winger who resigned his office yesterday, the most left-wing leader Ireland has ever had, Mr. Varadkar. Oh, it's like...
Well, that would be easy. The party would fit.
The numbers don't lie.
Yeah. Recording. Anyway.
Lots of editing.
I'll be busy later. No, it's just, I suppose we have this sense of dread about where things are headed. And then we have what I think I was trying to talk about earlier, which is the stagnation and this holding on to older ways. And then folks who you would, you know, kind of unlikely bedfellows around kind of, you know, policy institutional change that could make the parliament actually something that could act as a bulwark for more democratic erosion. But the kinds of instruments or the kinds of efforts to do to kind of address that are also potentially repressive, I suppose, for other, because they aren't based on any kind of, I suppose, notion of pluralism, really. There isn't any real kind of discussion of, you know, the kind of Chantal Mouffe notion of democracy that you would actually have that kind of dissent. It is more this kind of regulatory thing around political advertising, funding, media disinformation, which are important, but they don't fundamentally get at the kind of the principles of what we might understand to be kind of a vibrant, high energy democracy.
But against that, I would say slightly on the rule of law. You remember the Commission did this disgraceful deal before Christmas to hand over 10 billion euros to Hungary that had been withheld for all these abuses. And the European Parliament is now taking the Commission to court because the Commission is supposed to be the guardian of the EU treaties. And to me, there's been a long-standing tradition where the Parliament is the one institution that regularly does stand up for democracy and the rule of law. And I really worry about that into the future and the implications of what the realignment is.
If it's impulse and status preservation, you know, if that is a very strong impulse or imperative, you know, and then that there isn't enough support in other places, you would worry about it being able to be robust enough to fulfill that role. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks very much. No, it's like, I suppose we're getting away from, I suppose, to some degree, the role of the Parliament and getting into a deeper discussion about the nature and role of democracy, wherever it is. And I think it is interesting that you're riffing off the rule of law and you're talking about democracy as a dialogical kind of concept where dissent and consensus is negotiated and mediated. They're quite different animals, aren't they? I mean, you need quite different institutions probably to manage the scale of what's required of democracy. And I suppose it's what Mary was saying about just the nature of institutions themselves and how over time they do become Bavarian and solidified, no matter what the agency and the culture is within them, that the power of the institutions are quite strong and you've got path dependency of the institutions. And while we were in Brussels, John, during that wonderful time together, I was at the European presidency, the Belgium European presidency on just transition, which was a 2-day meeting where they were genuinely trying to imagine an institutional architecture or what the EU needed to do to develop capacities and actions and agencies around just transition. And it was quite fascinating because there you were looking at it, you were in an institution trying to imagine other institutions and debating whether or not they should or not, and also then dealing with the politics of who was in the room and what was in the room and stuff like that. And what struck me, really struck me, Anna, when you were talking about those young parliamentary assistants, and just the wonderful capacity for human action, like just the range of actors that are in Brussels, the skills, the political energy, the hope is really strong. Like you're really struck by it. And they all seem to be contained within institutions that are a mismatch for who they are and what they can do. Particularly, there's an age dynamic there, maybe where the real power actors in the more formal institutions are older men, and the younger actors are often, people coming over on stages and getting jobs in the EU, and they're full of it's a really contradictory space. And I just wondered about, do you see a tension there in what might happen to those institutions? Is there a day-to-day tension in the viability of the institutions given the people? And Commission is the same. Commission is full of really good, bright young people who are really doing their best to make the thing happen despite the institutional rules around them and the power obstacles. So just wondered about that tension.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can say anything about tension, but I think something we wanted to do in the project was also to kind of breathe life in the parliament, so to say, because it's often seen as this very technocratic place. And we also wanted to show how many different actors there are working within the structures of this, in a way, a bit faceless institution, and to really show their passion and their struggles and the conflicts and the effects that are there. It's not just, it might appear as technocratic, but when you scratch the surface, there is kind of like the whole breadth of human life there, like lots of overlapping political struggles, from the staff mobilizing for safer working environments to women MEPs from different groups sitting together and thinking what to do with the AI. So there is a lot happening there. And then you also have the extra parliamentary actors, the civil society and the experts, and how this then comes together. Then you have the relationships between the institutions. There's, of course, kind of the more formal part of that happens in the trilogues, but there is constant exchange and informal talk between.
And one of the arguments about Ireland and Europe after 1973 that we were very successful was we learned how to do the informal stuff, and we did it better than most countries. I was going to say to Rory, if you're looking for a parliamentary assistant, come the summertime, we have quite a few talented people lined up there beside you.
Long way to go between here and there.
Does anybody else want to ask a question? Ezekiel, yes, I'll give you this mic. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just in regards to Social Europe. It's a really popular kind of policy package, and the issues it brings up often poll very well. However, given the kind of the rise of the far right in the European Parliament, even though the far right is predominantly male-dominated space, they're still going to. It's most likely that will run some female candidates. My question to you is, how do you think those female candidates will have to kind of campaign effectively against a very popular policy that their voters are most likely to support? How do you think they're going to campaign against us?
Sorry, what policy?
The policies within Social Europe, the Social Europe package.
Well, I think that the main campaigning term against more Social Europe is the argument about subsidiarity, and it's framed as less of a question of should we have social rights or not, and it's more framed as a question of what the EU should do and what not. Should the EU come to our space and try to undermine our way of doing things? And kind of this, if the EU is gonna say something about that. Soon they are gonna say something about that other topic too. And this is the type of argument against social Europe that you would also see from countries like Sweden and Finland, that you might expect to be supportive of stronger social Europe. So it's not that much maybe the fear that the EU regulations are gonna put like a lower standard than ours, and then the standards are gonna be decreased. It's more that the EU should not interfere here. And this is also the kind of argument that you would hear from a lot of MEPs from the leftist political groups as well. For instance, in the debates about the minimum wage directive, there was a lot of MEPs from Austria, Germany, Finland, Sweden, not sure where Ireland stood. They were just saying that no, EU shouldn't go here.
From the left, that's the sort of
Yeah.
that when I saw your slide there, and you said this division within the left on the minimum
Yeah.
wage. Was it that the neoliberal European Union is not doing enough, or?
No, it's that the EU should not interfere with our social bargaining system, basically, because wages in countries with a strong collective bargaining system, there is specific, they're very sensitive issues, and they are seen as something that the employers and the trade unions should agree together. So it's seen as a
Is the issue of climate change beginning to shift that dialogue a little bit? Like the just transition debate was about social policy as well. It was right in the middle of the two. And most of the arguments coming back were protect growth, protect competition, and at a very macro level. The old-fashioned argument about subsidiarity was less in the room because it was a more direct eco-social or green capitalism kind of debate, and it didn't really matter where you were doing it to some degree.
Climate change affects everyone.
It certainly was a more European debate. I felt than
Maybe it's the weight of the existential threat.
It brings growth into tension, like social policy and growth, no problem. So you're not going to fight about that. You go to fight about subsidiarity, but this wasn't. This was more a direct questioning of growth. So the nature of the defense of growth was more maybe European than saying about subsidiarity. I was surprised at how much the attack came. No innovation, no new social policy. Protect growth and all of that. But it wasn't protect subsidiarity.
And it's interesting also about the question of the neoliberal aspects of the EU social policy. So it's obviously very well known that when EU does social policy, it has been in the terms of the economy. It's policies that basically prepare people to the needs of the market. A lot, it's about increasing the labor supply in different ways. But then it's mainly in the European Parliament, there is not much debate about this. So the MEPs, even from the leftist groups, they are happy when the Commission does something new, when there is new legislation. They might try to tweak the text a bit to bring a bit more social rights-oriented ideas in them, maybe remove some parts about how good this is for economic growth. But apart maybe from GUE, there is very little criticism of the Commission's social policy. So it's basically just kind of taken as it is, and but also I think GUE, being this kind of challenger group who's not always part of the big coalitions and who doesn't have this like weight of needing to appear as a responsible decision maker and legislator, they are a bit more free to say things that the other groups might say, even though some MEPs might personally feel that.
Okay, I wonder whether there's any further question. If there isn't, we will draw this session to a conclusion. And in doing so, I want to really pay tribute to Anna to thank her. The research is absolutely fascinating. Wish you all the best with everything that you're doing and you may be doing in the future. And you really generated a really large range of responses and reactions, and that's always a sign of something that's really, really good and appreciated. So thank you very, very much indeed. I want to say thank you to Pauline as well for her responses and for all the work that she does in this field. We were in Brussels a few weeks ago, we had an alumni event, and it was great to see one of our students, when she was asked what kind of courses really influenced you, she said gender and politics at Maynooth. And this is somebody who's really doing terrific work as a health policy researcher in Brussels. So that's always very nice when that happens. So thanks to Pauline and thanks to everybody. And thanks again to Anne, as always.